The atmosphere inside Beijing was already tense before Donald Trump delivered the message that would suddenly shake the entire summit. World leaders, diplomats, intelligence officials, and financial markets were watching every movement coming out of China as Trump and Xi Jinping held one of the most important meetings of the year. Trade wars, Taiwan tensions, artificial intelligence competition, sanctions, and the growing Iran crisis had already pushed global anxiety to dangerous levels. But then, in the middle of the high-stakes summit, Trump posted a chilling message that instantly changed the mood across the world. Referring to recent American military strikes against Iranian targets, Trump wrote, "The military decimation of Iran, to be continued." The Sun.co.uk. Within minutes, the statement exploded across international media. Markets reacted nervously. Diplomats rushed into emergency discussions. And suddenly, the carefully planned Trump-Xi summit was no longer dominated by trade negotiations or economic diplomacy. Iran had taken over everything. Inside Beijing, officials reportedly viewed Trump's message with immediate concern. Chinese leadership had hoped the summit would focus on stabilizing relations between Washington and Beijing after years of escalating tensions. Xi Jinping wanted the world to see China as a responsible global power capable of promoting stability during dangerous international crises. But Trump's warning created a completely different atmosphere. Instead of calming fears, the summit now appeared overshadowed by the possibility of renewed military escalation in the Middle East. Analysts around the world immediately began asking the same question. Was Trump simply using pressure tactics against Tehran? Or was he signaling that another round of American military action was already being prepared? The uncertainty itself became dangerous. Financial markets hate unpredictability, and Trump's message created instant uncertainty everywhere. Oil prices surged as traders feared new attacks could destabilize the Strait of Hormuz even further. Reuters.com. Shipping companies began reviewing security risks again. Investors moved cautiously. Governments across Europe and Asia quietly contacted diplomatic channels, searching for clarification about Washington's intentions. One sentence from Trump had suddenly transformed the entire geopolitical atmosphere surrounding the summit. The reason the warning created such panic was because tensions with Iran were already extremely fragile. American naval forces remained heavily deployed near the Gulf. Iranian military commanders continued threatening retaliation against Western pressure. Israel intensified operations against Hezbollah-linked targets across Lebanon and Syria. And the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil routes, remained dangerously unstable. Every major government understood that even one new military escalation could trigger economic shockwaves across the entire global economy. Trump's message appeared to suggest that the possibility of escalation was becoming more real, not less. Xi Jinping responded cautiously in public, refusing to inflame tensions further. Chinese state media emphasized stability, dialogue, and the importance of avoiding wider conflict. GlobalTimes.cn. But behind the scenes, analysts believed Beijing was deeply frustrated by Trump's timing. China depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies, and prolonged instability surrounding Hormuz threatened Chinese economic growth directly. Xi wanted the summit to project calm leadership and strategic diplomacy. Instead, Trump's warning shifted global attention back toward military confrontation. Yet some observers believed Trump's message was carefully calculated rather than emotional. Trump understood pressure and unpredictability often created leverage in negotiations. By issuing a public warning during the summit itself, he may have been sending signals simultaneously to Tehran, Beijing, Israel, and domestic audiences back in America. To Iran, the message suggested Washington remained prepared for further action. To China, it signaled that America expected stronger pressure on Tehran from Beijing. To Israel, it reassured allies that Washington had not softened its position despite diplomatic talks. And politically, the message reinforced Trump's image as a leader willing to project strength aggressively during international crises. But the danger with strategic ambiguity is that other governments may misinterpret intentions completely. Iranian officials responded angrily, accusing Trump of threatening illegal aggression while insisting Tehran would not surrender under pressure. Al Jazeera.com. Military analysts warned that even rhetorical escalation could increase risks dramatically in such a tense environment. When naval forces, missiles, drones, and regional militias are already operating near confrontation zones, political messages can quickly influence military calculations on all sides. The deeper concerns surrounding Trump's warning involved timing. The summit between Trump and Xi represented one of the few remaining diplomatic channels capable of reducing broader global tensions. Markets hoped the meeting would produce stability. Businesses wanted reassurance. Allies wanted predictability. Instead, the summit suddenly looked like a meeting happening under the shadow of possible war escalation. Reports emerged that emergency discussions regarding Iran quickly moved to the center of Trump and Xi's private negotiations after the warning spread internationally. RFRL.org. This showed how deeply interconnected the global crises had become. Trade, military strategy, oil markets, technology competition, and diplomacy were no longer separate issues anymore. Everything now influenced everything else simultaneously. Across Washington, Beijing, Tehran, and Tel Aviv, leaders understood the situation had entered a more dangerous phase. One side feared appearing weak. Another feared economic collapse. Another feared military encirclement. And all of them were now reacting to a single unpredictable message posted during one of the most sensitive summits in years. As night fell over Beijing and diplomatic teams continued private discussions behind guarded doors, uncertainty spread through governments and financial markets worldwide. Nobody fully knew whether Trump's to-be-continued warning represented negotiation pressure, political theater, or preparation for something far more serious. But one thing became impossible to deny. In just a few words, Trump had changed the entire atmosphere of the summit and reminded the world how quickly fragile diplomacy can move toward the edge of much larger conflict. Behind the massive red walls of Beijing's Zongnanhai leadership compound, far away from cameras and public speeches, President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping sat across from each other during one of the most tense diplomatic meetings in recent years. Outside the compound, the world saw carefully staged handshakes, ceremonial greetings, and diplomatic smiles. But inside those guarded rooms, the real conversation was dominated by one issue above everything else: Iran. Trade disputes, tariffs, artificial intelligence, and Taiwan still mattered, but after Trump's explosive, to-be-continued warning about Iran, the summit suddenly transformed into a crisis negotiation carrying enormous global consequences. Oil markets were unstable. The Strait of Hormuz remained dangerously tense. Military forces across the Middle East stayed on high alert. And now, the leaders of the world's two largest powers were attempting to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. Trump entered the meetings with a clear objective. He wanted China to pressure Tehran harder. Washington believed Beijing held enormous leverage over Iran because China remained one of Tehran's largest economic partners and the biggest buyer of Iranian oil. American officials understood something simple but important. Without Chinese cooperation, isolating Iran economically would become almost impossible. That reality gave Xi Jinping major influence during the negotiations. Trump reportedly pushed aggressively for Beijing to use its economic relationship with Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, reduce regional tensions, and stop Iran from advancing its nuclear program further. Trump also wanted assurances that China would not provide military support or advanced technology to Iran during the crisis. According to reports emerging from the summit, Xi privately told Trump that China would not send military equipment to Tehran, a statement Trump later praised publicly as a big commitment. But Xi Jinping's position was far more complicated than Washington wanted to admit publicly. China had deep strategic and economic ties with Iran built over many years. Beijing depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies, and Iranian oil remained critical for China's long-term energy security. At the same time, Xi also understood that prolonged instability surrounding the Strait of Hormuz threatened China's economy badly. Nearly a fifth agreement, analysts warned the deeper reality remained far more uncertain. Beijing supported non-proliferation publicly, but many experts doubted China would pressure Iran aggressively enough to risk damaging its own strategic relationship with Tehran completely. In other words, China wanted to prevent nuclear escalation without fully abandoning Iran as a regional partner. The Strait of Hormuz quickly became another central focus of the secret discussions. Trump warned Xi that continued disruption around Hormuz threatened the entire global economy and could trigger severe financial instability. She reportedly agreed that the strait must remain open to support the free flow of global energy supplies. Both leaders understood the danger clearly. Oil prices were already reacting violently to every military threat near the strait. Shipping companies faced rising risks, insurance costs exploded, and governments worldwide feared that even one major naval confrontation could trigger global recession fears almost overnight. Yet, despite areas of apparent agreement, mistrust dominated much of the summit privately. Trump believed Iran was delaying negotiations strategically while continuing destabilizing actions through proxies and regional pressure. She worried that Washington's military pressure against Tehran could spiral into a larger regional war, dragging global economies into chaos. Chinese officials also feared America might use the Iran crisis as justification for expanding military influence further across Asia and the Middle East simultaneously. Meanwhile, Washington remained deeply suspicious that Beijing was quietly helping Iran economically, while publicly presenting itself as a neutral diplomatic power. That distrust shaped nearly every discussion behind closed doors. Diplomats close to the summit described the atmosphere as professional but extremely tense. Trump reportedly pushed Xi repeatedly to do more regarding Tehran. She responded by emphasizing ceasefires, stability, and diplomacy, while resisting any appearance that China was acting under American pressure. Beijing wanted to position itself as a responsible global power promoting peace, not as Washington's strategic partner against Iran. That distinction mattered enormously to Chinese leadership because Beijing also watched how Russia, Gulf states, and developing nations perceived China's role globally. The deeper the conversations went, the clearer one reality became. The Iran crisis was no longer simply a regional issue. It had become deeply connected to the broader power struggle between the United States and China themselves. Every discussion about Iran linked back to trade, military competition, energy security, sanctions, and the future balance of global influence. Trump wanted stronger Chinese cooperation. She wanted reduced American pressure on China economically and strategically. Both leaders needed stability. Yet both leaders also continued competing for global leverage at the exact same time. As the secret talks stretched late into the night inside Zongnanhai, the world waited anxiously for signs of breakthrough or collapse. Publicly, both governments described the meetings as constructive and positive. But behind those diplomatic phrases stood a far harsher reality. Washington and Beijing were not simply negotiating over Iran anymore. They were testing whether two rival superpowers with growing mistrust could still cooperate enough to stop a regional crisis from becoming something far more dangerous for the entire world. The Iran war was no longer just a conflict between Washington and Tehran. What began as military escalation in the Middle East was now transforming the entire structure of global power politics. Across Beijing, Moscow, Brussels, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Washington, leaders were quietly recalculating alliances, economic strategies, military priorities, and long-term geopolitical survival. The Trump-Xi summit in Beijing proved this reality more clearly than ever, because behind every discussion about Iran, oil, and the Strait of Hormuz stood a much bigger question. Who would shape the future global? Prolonged instability because China depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies. Every threat near the Strait of Hormuz increased risks for Chinese manufacturing, shipping, and economic growth. Yet at the same time, Chinese strategists also recognized that America's growing focus on Iran created opportunities for Beijing globally. A confidential U.S. intelligence assessment reportedly warned that China was gaining strategic advantages from Washington's military and political distraction in the Middle East. Turn Zero News 15, while America concentrated resources on Iran, Beijing expanded influence economically, diplomatically, and technologically across other regions. China positioned itself publicly as a stabilizing force, calling for ceasefires and negotiations while portraying Washington as increasingly unpredictable and militarized. This image mattered enormously because many developing nations were already growing frustrated with global instability and economic disruption linked to Western-led conflicts. Russia also understood the opportunity immediately. Moscow benefited directly from rising oil prices caused by the Iran crisis, strengthening Russian energy revenues despite Western sanctions. Reuters reported that Russia's increased energy exports helped cushion global supply disruptions caused by the conflict, giving Moscow renewed importance in global energy markets. At the same time, the Kremlin recognized that prolonged American involvement in the Middle East weakened Washington's ability to focus on Ukraine, NATO expansion, and broader strategic competition against Russia itself. Analysts described the situation as a geopolitical risk war, where Russia and China were not necessarily trying to win militarily in Iran, but instead benefiting strategically from prolonged instability, weakening Western unity over time. Israel's role intensified the crisis even further. Israeli leaders believed Iran's regional influence represented an existential threat that could not simply be managed through diplomacy alone. Pressure inside Israel for stronger action against Tehran continued growing as Hezbollah activity increased near Lebanon and missile threats remained active across the region. Israeli officials worried that prolonged negotiations could allow Iran to strengthen strategically while the world focused on temporary diplomacy. This created growing tension between Washington's desire to avoid uncontrolled regional war and Israel's demand for stronger deterrence against Tehran. Gulf powers faced their own difficult calculations. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and neighboring states wanted stability desperately because their economies depended on secure shipping routes and regional calm. Yet they also feared growing Iranian influence and questioned whether Washington's long-term commitment to regional security remained fully reliable. As a result, several Gulf governments quietly strengthened ties with China and other powers simultaneously, trying to avoid dependence on only one global ally in an increasingly unstable world. Meanwhile, smaller nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America watched the crisis nervously because the Iran war was accelerating a broader global realignment already underway. Many governments no longer believed the world was dominated by one unquestioned superpower anymore. Instead, they saw a fragmented international system emerging where China, Russia, the United States, and regional powers all competed simultaneously for influence. This created enormous uncertainty because countries increasingly faced pressure to choose sides economically, technologically, and diplomatically. Trade systems began fragmenting. Financial networks shifted. Sanctions battles pushed countries toward alternative payment systems outside Western control. The deeper the Iran crisis expanded, the more this fragmentation accelerated. Technology competition added another dangerous layer to the global struggle. Artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, semiconductors, satellite systems, and energy infrastructure all became part of the geopolitical battlefield. China's rise in science and emerging technologies worried Washington deeply because American officials feared losing long-term strategic advantages in sectors shaping future military and economic power. The Iran war intensified those fears because it demonstrated how military conflicts could rapidly affect energy systems, supply chains, digital infrastructure, and global markets all at once. And perhaps the most dangerous part of the situation was that no major power fully trusted the others anymore. Washington believed Beijing and Moscow were quietly benefiting from American distraction. China feared the United States was trying to contain Chinese rise globally through military alliances and economic restrictions. Russia viewed prolonged instability as proof that Western-led global systems were weakening. Iran believed the conflict exposed the hypocrisy of American foreign policy. Israel feared diplomacy might eventually leave Tehran stronger. And ordinary countries caught in the middle worried the world was sliding toward a new Cold War-style era defined by competing blocs and permanent geopolitical tension. Analysts warned that the Iran crisis was accelerating a transition toward a fragmented multipolar world whose rules had not yet been fully defined. The old assumptions about globalization, American dominance, and international stability no longer seemed guaranteed. Energy markets, trade routes, military alliances, financial systems, and diplomatic partnerships were all shifting under the pressure of rising geopolitical rivalry. As Trump and Xi continued negotiations behind closed doors in Beijing, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Iran war was no longer simply about Iran. It had become a global test of power, influence, and survival in a world entering a far more unstable geopolitical era than the one that existed before the conflict began. The Strait of Hormuz had always been one of the most important waterways on Earth. But during the Iran crisis, it became something far more dangerous, the world's economic fault line. A narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Gulf states suddenly carried the weight of the entire global economy on its shoulders. Every tanker moving through the strait now traveled under the shadow of possible attack. Every military ship entering those waters risked confrontation. And every threat coming from Tehran, Washington, or Israel sent shockwaves through financial markets worldwide. As President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping continued tense negotiations in Beijing, the real pressure shaping their summit was not only happening inside diplomatic meeting rooms. It was unfolding thousands of miles away inside the narrow waters of Hormuz, where one mistake could trigger economic chaos across the planet. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That reality makes Hormuz one of the most strategically important trade routes in modern history. Oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates moves through those waters toward global markets constantly. If the strait becomes unstable, fuel prices rise almost immediately everywhere. Transportation costs increase. Inflation spreads. Stock markets panic. And governments across the world suddenly face economic pressure they cannot control. This is why military tensions near Hormuz created such enormous fear during the Iran crisis. Tehran understood the strait gave Iran powerful leverage against stronger military powers. The United States understood that protecting the route was critical for global economic stability. And China understood that prolonged disruption threatened the survival of energy-dependent economies across Asia directly. The crisis intensified rapidly after reports emerged of multiple attacks and seizures involving commercial shipping near the strait. One vessel was reportedly seized while another tanker suffered severe damage after suspected military action in nearby waters. The Australian.com.au, those incidents sent immediate shockwaves through energy markets. Oil prices surged sharply within hours as traders feared the strait could become fully militarized if tensions escalated further. Shipping companies rushed to reassess security risks. Insurance costs for vessels operating near Hormuz exploded overnight. And governments quietly began preparing contingency plans in case the waterway became partially blocked or too dangerous for commercial traffic. Iran's strategy surrounding Hormuz was built around asymmetric pressure. Tehran knew it could not defeat the U.S. Navy directly in traditional warfare. But Iran also understood it did not need total military victory to create global instability. Fast attack boats, naval mines, drones, missile systems, and proxy operations gave Tehran the ability to threaten shipping routes continuously without engaging in direct full-scale war immediately. Iranian commanders repeatedly warned that if Tehran faced overwhelming military pressure, Hormuz itself could become unsafe for global energy flows. Those warnings terrified markets because even limited disruption inside the strait could trigger severe economic consequences worldwide. The United States responded by expanding naval operations across the Gulf. American destroyers, surveillance aircraft, and carrier strike groups increased patrols near Hormuz, while military officials promised freedom of navigation would be protected at all costs. Trump's administration viewed the strait as a red line because closure or severe disruption could damage the global economy dramatically while weakening American credibility internationally. But military buildup itself also increased risks. The more warships entered the region, the greater the possibility of miscalculation became. One accidental collision, one drone strike, one missile misunderstanding, and suddenly the entire situation could spiral into direct confrontation between major powers operating inside crowded waters already filled with tension. China watched the situation with growing alarm. Beijing depended heavily on Middle Eastern oil imports, and nearly half of China's imported energy moved through routes connected to Hormuz. This is one reason the strait became such a major focus during Trump and Xi's private negotiations in Beijing. Both leaders reportedly agreed the strait must remain open because global economic stability depended on it. AA.com.tr, yet despite shared concern, neither side fully trusted the other's long-term intentions. Washington feared Beijing would continue protecting Tehran economically while publicly calling for peace. China feared America might use military escalation to strengthen strategic influence across the Middle East and Asia simultaneously. Meanwhile, ordinary people around the world began feeling the effects of Hormuz instability directly. Fuel prices climbed steadily in Europe, Asia, and North America. Airlines warned about rising operational costs. Transportation companies raised prices. Food supply chains faced increasing pressure as energy costs spread through global logistics systems. Inflation fears returned aggressively at a moment when many economies were already struggling with slowing growth and financial uncertainty. Investors reacted nervously to every military update from the Gulf. Markets no longer viewed Hormuz simply as a regional security issue. It had become one of the central vulnerabilities threatening the global economy itself. Businesses worldwide also feared the consequences of prolonged disruption. Manufacturing sectors dependent on stable shipping and energy prices faced growing uncertainty. Financial institutions prepared for worst-case scenarios involving recession risks and deeper market instability. Insurance firms raised maritime risk classifications across the Gulf region. Some shipping companies even began exploring alternative trade routes despite higher costs, because executives feared the strait could become too dangerous if tensions continued escalating. The deeper the crisis evolved, the clearer one reality became. The world economy remained far more fragile than many leaders publicly admitted. A narrow waterway thousands of miles away from most consumers suddenly held enormous influence over inflation, trade, transportation, and global financial confidence. And that reality transformed Hormuz from a regional choke point into a global economic fault line capable of shaking international stability itself. As Trump and Xi continued negotiations under the shadow of the Iran crisis, military ships kept moving through the Gulf while oil markets reacted to every rumor coming from Tehran or Washington. Diplomats spoke publicly about peace and stability. But beneath the diplomacy, the fear remained constant. Because everyone understood the same thing. If the Strait of Hormuz truly exploded into open conflict, the consequences would not stay limited to the Middle East. They would spread across the entire world economy faster than almost anyone could fully control.